Chapter 1. Origin of the Orcs. Introduction. Orcs are some of the most recognizable creatures in fantasy literature and pop culture. Although their image is often associated with Tolkien, it is actually based on ancient myths and folklore. In this chapter, we will consider the origin of orcs and their evolution in world mythology. Orcs in early myths. The first mention of orcs can be found in the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf, where the term Orkneys was used to refer to monsters and demonic creatures. Other early cultures, such as the Greek and Roman, had similar monsters that represented destruction and chaos. Origin of the term orc. The word orc probably comes from Latin, where Orcus is the name of an underworld deity associated with death. Over time, this term was transformed and began to be used to denote evil monsters. Ancient analogues. In various mythologies, there were creatures that resembled orcs. For example, in Scandinavian mythology, there are trolls, giants and monsters living in mountains and forests. In Celtic mythology, there are also references to wild, uncivilized creatures resembling orcs. Connection with the forces of evil. Orcs have been perceived since ancient times as a symbol of the forces of evil and destruction. In many myths, they are messengers from the dark worlds, or chaos that appear to disrupt harmony and order. Second chapter 2. Orcs in medieval folklore. Introduction. The Middle Ages brought a new stage in the development of the image of orcs. During this period, monsters and monstrosities were often used as symbols of sinfulness, demonism, and barbarism. In this chapter, we will examine how the image of orcs and similar creatures evolved in medieval Europe. Monsters and barbarians. Medieval folklore abounded with tales of monsters that lived on the fringes of the civilized world. These beings were often identified with real or mythical barbarians who threatened Christian society. Orcs as symbols of sin. In medieval texts, orc-like monsters represented human sins such as anger, cruelty, and greed. It was a period when external ugliness was directly associated with internal moral degradation. Image transformation. In medieval legends and epics, such as the Song of Roland, images of vicious orc-like enemies can be found. These were barbaric, uncivilized peoples who were depicted as the antithesis of noble knights and defenders of the Christian faith. Connection with nature. Like other creatures, orcs have often been associated with the wild. In folklore, they were depicted as inhabitants of dark forests, mountains, or underground worlds, which symbolized hidden danger. Third chapter 3. Evolution of orcs in modern literature. Introduction. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the images of monsters and monsters acquired a new development in literature. Orcs, or creatures that resembled them, became a symbol of public fears of the unknown and strangers. In this part, we will consider how monsters went from folklore monsters to literary characters. Monsters in Gothic literature. In modern literature, especially in Gothic novels, the images of monstrous creatures revived with renewed vigor. Monsters became the personification of fear of the unknown and dark aspect of human nature. Although orcs were not directly mentioned in this period, their counterparts are present in the works of writers such as Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker. Fantasy literature and the first images of orcs. The beginning of the 20th century brought with it the development of fantasy literature, which drew inspiration from medieval and ancient myths. Writers began to create new worlds inhabited by fictional races. Although orcs were not yet clearly defined as a race, elements of them began to appear in fantasy worlds. Tolkien's influence. J.R.R. Tolkien was the one who finally shaped the image of orcs that became a classic in fantasy literature. The orcs in his Lord of the Rings are cruel, ugly creatures created by Sauron for war. They became the embodiment of absolute evil, created to destroy and enslave the world. Symbolism of orcs. In Tolkien's works, orcs symbolize not only physical threat, but also moral degradation. They are distorted versions of other races, which emphasizes the theme of corruption and fall in his works. Chapter 4. Orcs in Modern Pop Culture. Introduction. Modern pop culture has made corrections to the image of orcs. Thanks to video games, movies, and comics, orcs have become one of the most popular races in the fantasy genre. In this part, we will consider modern interpretations of orcs. Film industry influence. Films based on Tolkien's books, including The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, portrayed orcs as brutal, soulless warriors. Thanks to special effects and makeup, the orcs took on an even more frightening appearance, cementing their image in pop culture. Orcs in video games. In video games, orcs often appear as enemies of the players or have more complex roles. In the orcs in comics and fantasy worlds, orcs have become an important part of the fantasy genre in other media as well. In comics such as Warhammer 40,000, orcs are depicted as aggressive yet humorous creatures that create chaos. Their image combines both fear and satire on some aspects of human behavior. Variety of orc images. Modern culture has evolved the image of orcs, adding more depth to them. Now they can be both brutal enemies and complex characters with their own history,